Hello and welcome. This is Transformative, and I have a very special guest today, Ken Symington. And Ken is an author, a teacher. He's taught with LL Ministries for
20 years.
20 years.
Yes.
And he's the founder of the ministry Christian Restoration in Ireland. And he's also a conference speaker. And I was introduced to Ken through these tapes, the Father Heart of God series with LL Ministries. And then I just read his book, Loved Like Never Before. And I want to recommend to anyone who's never been introduced to Ken to get the tapes, to get the book, because his ministry, I believe, will change your life in a really positive and a beautiful way. And so thank you, Ken, for joining me. I really, really am grateful.
Oh, it's a privilege. Trust me. It's a privilege.
So I'm just going to jump in. The subject is the Father Heart of God. And Father is an emotive word. And I know when I was first saved, I was angry at the thought of God being a father. And in my mind, he was cruel and capricious and just horrible. And it took time for the Lord to show me first that I was very deeply afraid of him, but then that I hated him. Behind that fear was hatred. And the Lord is so gentle and patient because his heart is that of a father, a true father. And he gently worked in me until I began to realize that I had taken what my dad did, which was like this much evil, and put it onto God, who's sovereign and could do immense evil. And I had a confusion about the Father heart of God because my father was not good. And so father is a very emotive word.
Yes. Yes.
And yet that's the word God chose for himself. Why would God choose to be known by such a title that can cause so much pain to so many people?
Yeah. Your story echoes just so many people's story. Interestingly, I was speaking in England about 3 weeks ago at a conference, and at the end of it, a lady came up to me crying her eyes out, and I thought it was something I must have said that upset her, but it turned out it was the opposite. She said, I didn't know it was going to be you speaking today. She said, I can't believe it. I just wanted to come up and tell you that I read your book 3 years ago, and it so transformed my life that I can't even put into words the different human being that I am. Mm-hmm. And she cried for about 5 minutes as she hugged me. It is such, it is, when you get it, it's a very emotive word. But when it's a damaged word, it's a very emotive word. You know, most words are neutral words like computer, carpet, fish tank. You know, your heart doesn't move by most words, but there are many, of course, positive words and phrases which are very emotive, like I love you and I care for you, I protect you, trust me, I trust you. But there's also a lot of powerful negative words like shower, cancer, rape, massacre, incest, hate. And unfortunately, in this fallen world, with more than a little help from the devil, the word father, which is always meant to be a very powerful, positive, emotive word, with all the positive words of security and protection and love and value and understanding, unfortunately, it's been trashed and put in with all the powerful negative words. And I often start off my weekend teachings by saying this, that if you're a Christian and you're standing in an empty room and suddenly Gabriel appeared before you and said, God wants to speak to you, and he points to the back of the hall, and you turn around and there's 3 great big doors, and one says, God the Father, one says God the Son, one says God the Holy Spirit. And you say, which door will I go to? And Gabriel says, it doesn't matter. In my experience, everybody would go to the middle door, God the Son, Jesus. Some who didn't like queues might nervously knock on the door of God the Spirit, not entirely sure what they'd meet, but virtually nobody would go to the door marked God the Father, because you know what fathers are like, don't you? And so I always say, my prayers at the end of the book or the end of the course, that if that happened, your first instinct would be to run to God the Father's door, thinking, I can't wait to get in there. And so that's that whenever Satan damages the image of Father and flips it from being what should be the most comforting, secure, safe, just the most powerful positive word you could ever imagine, and sadly it's been trashed. And so it really is a real, it's really just, I think it's the biggest thing on God's heart, is to see this changed. Because I often say that I've been teaching for nearly 30 years. I've been full-time for 25 years. And over that time I've taught dozens and dozens of subjects, but I always say, if God only gave me one subject for the rest of my life to teach, it would be the Father Heart of God, because I have seen that change more lives than all the other teachings in total put together. It's very simple. God loves you. we might know that here, but getting that through the damage to land and root and grow in here, that's the spiritual battle.
Yes, I agree. So your dad loved the Lord Jesus. He loved the Word of God.
He did.
And yet you suffered a deep father wound. Would you share about that?
Yes, I will indeed. I didn't know that I had a very good father until I started ministering to other people, and then actually realized that, goodness, my father wasn't perfect, but I have to say, compared to some of the stories I've heard over the last 30 years, I thank God for him, but he wasn't perfect. And one of the weaknesses that he had was that he was a very intelligent man, but because of the poverty in his house, that he had to leave work at 14. He had always dreamt of maybe going to university, but in his very low poverty place, that was never going to happen. And so he kind of ended up owning a little tiny shoe shop in a very poor part of Belfast. All his life, he hated every day at it, selling cheap shoes to people that were very often couldn't even afford cheap shoes. So his dream was, when I was his only son and his firstborn, so his dream was that he would do whatever it took to get me to university, to have all the privileges that he dreamt of having. The only thing was, I just didn't like school, and school didn't really like me. And by a miracle, I passed the first exam at the age of 11, which meant I got into grammar school rather than secondary school. Grammar school was intended to prepare you for university. Secondary school was more intended to get you towards a trade like carpentry, plumbing, etc. And so he was so proud of me. But I never got it. And so when the first exam came along at 14, I knew I would fail it, because it was quite a cruel exam, because even if you passed geography, history, science, all those things, if you failed either mathematics or English, you failed everything. Well, mathematics was I just couldn't do it. And so I went fishing on the day of the exam. And so I knew I would fail. I just wasn't going to be embarrassed, like sitting there staring at what I didn't understand. But my dad was very good. He could be a wee bit feisty, but everything would blow over in 5 minutes. And so I just thought, he'll be angry for 5 minutes and then he'll get over it. But that's not what happened. When the envelope came in, this brown envelope, and he opened it and he took it out, and there was a big F in black. I found it recently, or a few years ago, a big black F just for failure, for fail. And so I was waiting for him to get a bit angry, you know, but he didn't. He just stared at it, and then he put it into the envelope, and he put the envelope down and he walked out of the room. And I thought, oh, I got off of that very easily, but that wasn't the case. For the rest of the day, he didn't speak to me. Mm-hmm. Or the next day, 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 or the next day. No one had ever seen my dad behave like this ever. And he couldn't look at me, he couldn't talk to me. And so after a week, my mum said, Kenneth, you're going to have to put this right with your dad. This atmosphere is awful, and it was awful. So he used to keep out in the backyard of our house. He kept sort of wild birds in a big cage that they could fly up and down in. And once a week, he went out to clean all the bird poo. He got inside the cage. So I might have failed the exam, but I wasn't stupid. I made sure he was in the cage first before I went out to talk to him. And I said, Dad, I'm really sorry that I failed the exam. And he started trying to turn his back on me, but he found it hard in the wee narrow cage. And he started brushing harder and harder. And I said, Dad, I'm really sorry I failed the exam. And it took about 3 or 4 times. And then finally, the balloon burst and he threw the brush on the ground. And he said, first of all, he sadly said, when I meet other fathers, I'm going to be ashamed. Mm. He said, you know, I'll be speaking to Barry Ferguson's father today, and Barry was one of these brilliant guys at school, and he said, how am I going to tell him that my son failed? Well, of course, instantly, you can imagine what that did to me. And then he said, and you know, you'll never be able to get a good job, hold down enough money to have a family. So he had this kind of a rant, and then it was over. And life went on. Life went on as if it had never happened. But you see, at that moment in time, I realized that because I hadn't performed well, he was ashamed of me and didn't even want to speak to his own son. And also declared me that I would be a failure. And so even though life went on, and it was buried in my conscious mind because life went on. You go out, play football, you do this. But it had a devastating effect on me. Yes. From that moment onwards, that was a turning point in my life. In fact, I'm even getting emotional talking about it after sort of all these years. But yeah, it had a devastating effect on me. It really did, yeah. Even though he was a good dad in all the other ways, he was a good provider, good protector. Yes, he was on all those points, but that was a massive blow to me.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure part of what he was going through was out of his own woundedness.
Oh, totally. When I meet him in heaven, I give him a big hug and say, I understand completely. Yeah. I understand. But when you're 14, you don't understand anything.
You can't understand that, can you?
You just take everything at face value, that your father knows everything about the world. Your father has life, understands life. And therefore, if he didn't even want to speak to me for a week, if he was ashamed to meet Barry Ferguson's father, if he said I was never going to have a good job, well, that was me pretty much in a box. And so I carried that as part of my identity.
That became your identity, didn't it?
Absolutely. It became part of my identity. And it's only, of course, with hindsight, you can look back and see how it changed it. But I suppose I could have gone one of two ways. I could have either not tried and just let that roll over me. But I went the opposite way, in that I was so terrified of this monster called failure. He always seemed to be about 2 meters behind me. Yeah. I tried so hard at everything I did, not at school, because that was a total disaster. But once I got out of school, you know, I started as a message boy in a newspaper, and I just, I did everything better than anybody else could. And I eventually worked my way up to being, you know, well, owning 5 companies, but it was never out of ambition. It was purely ambition. Money had nothing to do with it. It's just that I had to prove to myself that I wasn't this terrible failure, that I had some worth. And
Yes.
and also it seemed that everybody I met, whether it was in business or anybody who came to our home, I always had this need to impress them.
Mm.
I'd won a lot of medals at sport, and they had to come round. I had to find a way to bring them round and show them all my trophies from work and my trophies from. I was trying to do it as humbly as I could, but everybody got the whole package. And sometimes after they were gone, I would say, why do I have to behave that way?
Mm.
It sounds like I'm proud and I'm arrogant, and nothing could be further from the truth. I just couldn't stop needing to tell people that I was somebody.
Yes. And that was because that very real need that your dad was to give to you was never given to you.
No, I thought I was just a special son that he loved. And I know he did love me. I know he did. It was just as damaged as you say, but it just left me feeling that when I was talking to anybody, they could see who I was. And so I was trying to give a covering. And at some time when I went to the bigger school, I developed a stammer. But after that, my stammer got so bad that it crippled my life pretty much. And it didn't stop me achieving in business. But it was a long battle with a couple of nervous breakdowns over my stammer, because I couldn't say my name. I couldn't say my wife's name. I couldn't make phone calls. I had to get a secretary to make my phone calls. But once I knew you, I could talk, but even going into a shop to ask for sweets, I had to have the sweets in my hand and the money in the other hand. And so I had to plow through life, not wanting to meet people that I didn't know, because my stammer was so bad. And my stammer wasn't anything physical. It was because I really felt inside, I'm a nobody and a failure. And everybody, if I don't let everybody know that I've done this and done that, they'll see straight through me, and the shame of that. So yeah, it had a huge impact in my life. Yeah.
It's amazing how the words of our parents, especially our dad, can be a blessing or a curse. And that was literally a word curse over your life that would have huge impact on you. So
yes. I mean, as the Bible says that, our tongues have the power of life and death.
Yes.
And there was things that he said that were, I remember he said in front of friends, and the positive, I heard him saying to them, one thing about Kenneth, he can never tell a lie. Now, I actually had, but he just never caught me out. But they weren't big lies, but I heard him saying that to his friends. And that meant so much to me that even as a non-Christian, I found it virtually impossible to tell a lie, because I held on to that he was proud of me, because he said, Kenneth can never tell a lie. And so to me, that was a positive, and I hung on to that. So yeah, words can bring life, and words can bring death. That's why I understand why Jesus said that we'll be held accountable for every careless word that we speak, because like, we're not held accountable for every goal we didn't score on the football pitch, or for everything because it's not important, but because words are so powerful that's it. Being able to speak, especially when you've had a stammer up until you were 47, being able to speak to me is a gift that I didn't have until I was 47. And so I understand how powerful words are. And so, yeah, I understand why Jesus said that.
Yeah. So how did having a wrong view of the Father heart of God impact your life?
Well, it really just in those ways that I said, that it stripped me of worth, because you see, in the Old Testament, the only two exceptions are Melchizedek, which we know why, and Eli, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but everybody's introduced by who they're the son of, who they're the son of, the son of it, because it was always that understanding that you got your identity from your father. you got your love from your mother, your unconditional love from your mommy who'd do everything for you 24/7, but you got your identity from your father. And it's like whenever David said, "I'll fight Goliath," they didn't say who's he the son of.
Yeah.
You know, and so right in the New Testament, on the opening pages, you get the genealogy that God attached to his son Jesus as his line coming out. You know, and so it was like my identity was crushed. And I didn't really know who I was. Was I this advertising man? Was I a sportsman? Who was I? I was always trying to find out who I am, because my identity was kind of crushed.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that was, and of course, in society, I see all around, especially in the number of young suicides. Over here in Northern Ireland, the suicide rate of young people is just, mostly men too, is so high. And the number of what we call feral youths are just running around the streets from 13 and 14 years of age, and little gangs with the hoodies up, and they're you know, it's at a level that never was there when I was a boy. And it's this fatherless. I remember an ex-work person, a lady. I was talking to her years later after I'd left work, and she was saying that when her daughter was at school, there was 33 people in her class, and she was the only one who still had their original father and mother.
Wow.
I mean, wasn't that, that was quite a staggering. That was so in a sense, where God intended mum and dad to be a covering, and we'd get our sense of unconditional love, especially from our mums, but we'd get that protection, that provision, that sense of identity and worth coming from father. And so when the world just, "I don't like you, go away," and all these, you know, it's as Obama said when he was a president, that fatherlessness is the greatest problem in America. You know, so it really is a big thing.
Now, you raised an interesting point about covering.
Yes.
That your dad should have been a covering to you.
Yes.
And that covering was ripped away. And in your book, you mentioned going through a difficult time as a Christian, a dark night of the soul.
Yes.
I imagine part of that was because you had no covering. Did you feel, okay.
No, sorry. Yes, I would say what actually went through it, I don't go into detail in it in the book, because it was totally demonic. Somebody laid hands on me and something happened. But God used it because he was stripping me down. It turned out that what the enemy intended for evil, God turned for good, because when I came out of it, God took me off on the journey I'm on now. But I learned so much during it about myself, about God, about the reality of the devil. I learned so much through it. But yeah, there was that time whenever I was I think a very sane person, but anyway, I went through a very, very dark time, and nobody could understand what had happened to me, and I couldn't. And
did you feel like God approved of you?
I felt God had completely left me. I felt I'd done something. I felt that if this could happen to me, God had obviously just got fed up with me and walked away, and the devil had free access to me. As it turned out, with hindsight, in actual fact, God couldn't have been closer. But that's with the joy of hindsight. But at the time when I was going through it, I just thought, my goodness me, I was a Christian for 6 months. I was on fire for Jesus, and then suddenly this. But of course, I actually put everything I've done in the sort of 28 years since then down. That was the turning point in my life. God used that very, very powerfully, very, very powerfully. In fact, at some of the LL centers on the advanced courses, I do a deeper teaching into the dark night of the soul. You know, Joseph Joseph went through a dark night of the soul. Moses went through a dark night of the soul. So it's very easy for Moses or Joseph to think God had actually left them, but there was something was being outworked, and whenever they come out of that, then they're kind of it stripped me down honestly, and then anyway, it's for another teaching, but this is the point that I mention in the book and mention it in my teaching, in that quite a few denominations tried to help me but had no understanding what was going through, but eventually the minister of the church I was in decided after about 8 months that my dark night lasted a year, all but 3 days, and anyway he brought down 4 men who said who know about these things, and to be fair, they really did have an understanding about this, but anyway I still had to go through it until Jesus set me free one night at the dining room table. But this is the point I'm actually getting to, in that one of the men who was there, I can still picture him. He was an old man with pure white hair, but he was about 6'2", so I can only imagine when he was young, he must have been nearly a giant. You know, he was a big, you couldn't miss him. He's the only face I can remember out of the 4 men. But anyway, they came down to pray with me and to communion, etc., etc. But he said to me, Kenneth, don't you know if you were to lie on that couch and do nothing for a year, that your Heavenly Father would still love you? And I remember as clearly as anything, giving him the answer that I knew was biblically right. Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I know that, I said. But inside, there was this anger, this silent scream, and what I was silently screaming was, you fool, you stupid man, you and I both know that if I was to lie on that couch and do nothing for a year, God would turn his back on me and wouldn't speak to me. And I believe, so I gave him the answer that I knew was the right answer, but the real truth was screaming inside. And I actually believed he knew what we were saying was what God wanted to hear, but it wasn't really true. That we both knew if we didn't perform for God, he would just turn his back. And so that was my starting point. So for God to be able to get somebody who that was their starting point, have them teach the Father heart of God for sort of 25 years and write a book on it and what have you. It's with hindsight quite unexpected to have that sort of starting point. I just thought that if I was to lie on that couch, you see, whenever I got saved at first, I was truly on fire. I mean, I took off like a rocket, and I was out every night telling my neighbors all about Jesus, finding friends I hadn't called with for years. I went to every church meeting. In work, I took all my clients out for meals to tell them about Jesus. And so, and our minister even went on to the radio on the God Spot and said about these 2 people, Linda and I were both saved at the same moment in time, these 2 people who are turning the world upside down. And within a week, 2 of the people I trained with came to church with me and got saved. So for 6 months, I could understand God could love me because I was doing well.
You were doing well.
I was doing the business, and I could, if somebody said to me, does God the Father love you? I'd say, oh, yes, because I'm passing all the tests. I'm performing well. But then the carpet was pulled out from me, and not only could I not perform well, I felt I was now an embarrassment to the church. And so God would just turn his back and walk away, because that's what fathers do.
Isn't it wonderful that the Lord isn't like that?
I know.
That's really amazing, the impact of that and how it was driving you and you had no concept of it.
That's right. Totally.
Amazing.
Totally.
Now, you mentioned that your son wrote this little essay and it really thrilled your heart because he ended it by saying, he's a good dad to me and I love him. And so you would share that with people. But then one day the Lord said to you, Kenneth, I want you to say to me, you're a good dad to me and I love you. And I think you struggled with that at first, but when you said it, it became an important part of your healing. Could you tell
Yeah.
us about that? Why was
Yeah.
that significant?
Okay. Well, at that stage, I wasn't sharing it with anybody. I still was maybe a couple of years away from being a teacher. So I hadn't, but whenever David wrote me that sort of
Oh,
that
you still
essay,
have
that childish essay,
it.
yes, with all the spelling mistakes in it, and first of all, when I realized that the teacher had read this little, he's only 7 at the time. When I realized the teacher had read this, I was very nervous to see what he had written about me, because children don't tell lies. The teacher says, write a page on my mommy or my daddy, and children just, there's no filter. They just tell it.
Yeah.
And so I was nervously reading this when we found it in the school bag, thinking, what has he said about me? But it was all sort of neutral about fishing and going to Bear's Cave. But then at the bottom he said, he finished by saying, I think my dad's best hobby is fishing. And then he finished with, he's a good dad to me and I love him. Well, I felt I hadn't been a great father. I felt I'd been too busy at work, too busy with sport. I just felt, and when I read that, it was literally worth £1 million to me. I couldn't put a price on it. It was, I just stared at it and stared at it. And once I'd showed it to everybody I knew, I took it into work with me and found a way to very subtly, as if I really wanted to go around to say, everybody read that, but of course I was far too smart. I subtly brought it in so as many people could read it as possible, until finally one man's reaction on a tree, and I decided I was becoming obsessive, so I put it away, and it now sits over there in a frame in my office to this day. Staring at it in a blue frame. But so it was maybe only a couple of days, I think, after I finally put it in the frame and said, right, I have to stop showing everybody in the world this letter, that I was driving to work, and I suddenly felt God speaking to my spirit and say, what did you think of David's essay? And of course, when God asks you a question, it's not that he doesn't know the answer, he's just leading you along. And I said, well, Lord, you know how much it touched me. How many marks would you give it out of 10 for spelling? Well, there's a lot of spelling mistakes in it. He was only 7. I said, well, Lord, maybe 4 out of 10 if I was a teacher for spelling. Did that spoil it for you? I said, oh, not in the slightest. Absolutely, yes, that's the best he could do. And then he said, well, which sentence was it that touched you the most? And I said, well, Lord, you know, it's the sentence, he's a good dad to me and I love him. And then to my shock, I felt God speak in my spirit so clearly and say, can you say that to me? And that was the end of the two-way interaction. I was in my car, stuck in a traffic jam. And so I thought, and I thought, I thought in all honesty, I could say it, but to mean it now, but I thought I'd better say it, because if God said that, so I sort of just said, oh, okay, you're a good dad to me, and I love you. That must have sounded awful, but I said it again and again, and then I was aware that there was something nice happening somewhere deep inside my sort of belly, my sort of low, around here, not here, but here. And I began to notice this. So I started saying it more and more in the car, and then when I get into work, into my office, I kept saying it. When I even going to the bathroom, I was saying it. Driving home, I was saying it, until it became not only easy to say, but I actually felt I got to say I loved saying it. I actually loved saying it, because there was something inside me. This was doing something to me inside. And I kept wondering, what is it? Why, when I say this, is there something just nice? And then I realized I was sensing God's pleasure. I realized my spirit, we're one with Christ, with God. I've realized that I was actually sensing God's pleasure. That when God said he was a father, it wasn't just like a title he just picked and threw it out there. That it actually, like just the way when my son said to me, "You're a good dad to me and I love you," how it warmed my heart. I realized I was sensing God's pleasure. That I, as one of his children, one of his sons, was actually saying to him, "You're a good dad to me and I love you." Yeah. And so for about, I'm sure, a month, 2 months, I just said it everywhere I was on my own, out for a walk, driving the car, and it got to the stage where it was like somebody had put a drip of love into my heart, and there was a connection, and it seemed to be filling up my tank inside, which had been empty. And that was the beginning of me not only being aware that God loved me. It was a slow process from there onward, but that was the big turning point. And it also then, which is what I like when men get this, it also showed me too the responsibility I had as a father to 3 sons and a daughter. Yeah. That I had to represent God the Father. I got that. And so I worked really joyfully to actually be that kind of a dad. That when I suddenly realized, my goodness me, father's a big word. You know. And so anyway, that was the start of it. It wasn't the finish of it. That was certainly took me from ground zero to about the 4th stair. Yeah, but we were off ground zero and we were up and running. Yeah.
So that's interesting because the words of your dad caused harm. But then when you used words to affirm your love, to affirm the truth, you were renewing your mind. You were changing your DNA. And in the process, God was holding you close to his heart and loving you. And you were able to receive that love. It's such a beautiful picture of how speaking the truth about God and his heart can eradicate, erase, undo some of those evil, horrible words that have been spoken over us.
Look, I sometimes, if it's in season here and there's a couple of roses in our back garden that I don't know who put them there, but in the midst of everything else, there's a couple of rose bushes. But sometimes I'll go out and get a rose bud. And if it's a person who's struggling with rejection and low self-worth, etc., and I'll bring in a rose that's fully opened and a rose bud, and I'll say, which of those two is you? And they always point to the rosebud, and I said, yeah, that's how you see yourself. But and then I hammer the rosebud on the table, and I say, because that's our protective mold. Okay, but I said, I'm going to put this rosebud in a little jar of water. You can take it home with you. Just put it in the window in the sunlight and watch what happens. I said, angels don't have to come along and add fragrance into it. They don't have to come along and taint all the leaves. But whenever that rosebud knows that it's loved and it's been cared for, slowly that bud opens up, and all along inside was this beautiful, beautiful flower with this beautiful fragrance that everybody wants to smell and be drawn to, whereas everybody walks past the buds. But the buds are just roses that have never known that they're loved and they're cherished and they're precious. And you see, when I was getting the first bit of that, I was just aware that this bud of my heart was starting to, it was starting to open up slowly but surely. Yeah, very powerful.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. So in your book, you speak about hindrances to receiving the Father's heart of love.
Yes.
And really, we've been talking about that. But how have you gone on to find inner healing and overcome the negative emotions you had toward God? Because they don't magically disappear.
They don't magically disappear. It was a journey because after David's essay, then God, because I'd always been interested in outdoors, and I am to this day. I love wild places, and I keep track of all the birds that come into our garden, and and even in storms in the mountains, I go up camping in the middle of storms in the mountains. There's something about, and so God began to speak to me out of creation. I'd never really noticed it, other than there's trees and there's flowers and there's stuff. But God began to really show me, like Romans 1:20, that the invisible attributes of the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, are clearly seen through the things that are made. And I was aware that Jesus was always teaching of vines and fig trees and sheep and goats and sun and rivers and wheat and chaff. That the things that are made were revealing. And just God began a journey with me. And so on the Father Heart of God, when I do it a weekend at LL, one of the sessions is I take everybody out for an hour around the woods and the river. Oh. I've done this for 20 years now, in various countries. If they haven't attached out, and I take them around. And even just 3 weeks ago, one lady said, I've walked past trees and flowers and things there and never given them a second thought. She said, I absolutely can't believe how I did not see the wonder of God in creation. So God really opened he just opened the eyes of my spirit, because I was interested in that. And so I often say, what you're interested in, because we're all unique, God can and loves to speak to you. So if you like music, God can speak to you in music. I mean, for the astronomers, he didn't send a plant, he sent a star, because and so because it was creation for me, God began to speak to me, and that was a huge thing. And also then, as my heart began to open up, I began to see verses in the Bible that I'd just read them but never seen them. Like for instance, in John 14, where Philip says to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father and that'll be sufficient. That's the cry of so many hearts. And Jesus said, Philip, how long have you been with me? Don't you get it? When you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Yes. I only say what I hear the Father saying. I only do what I see the Father doing. So as I kind of got into that, I thought, yeah, Jesus didn't do anything of his own that was different from the Father. He said, I only do what I see the Father do. So if the Father said, go to that beggar, go to that blind person, go to that demonized person, tell that little man up the tree you're going to go home, that hated tax collector, Jesus only did what he saw the Father doing. And he only said what the Father wanted him to say. So that's why he said, Philip, don't you get it? When you've seen me, I and the Father are one. We're not like God's got this personality and I've got this personality, and like the two of us are just friends. As Paul says, the exact likeness, this express image. So as I began to take on a lot of scriptures, and in John 1:12, those who believe he gave the power to become children of God. And then he's talking about sons and daughters and newborn babes, Peter, newborn babes, infants, the family of God, firstborn. And that God was just all right through. God was just using this thing. And then when I went into the Old Testament, then I actually, especially when I was working with the drug dealers, this became a very powerful thing for them, is that God had this thing especially for the fatherless, for the orphan, for the widow. And in the Bible, it says God is very slow to anger. I began to see, in fact, I actually printed out all the verses in the Old Testament about God and his view on the fatherless children, and it ran to three pages just in the Old Testament, where you get this idea God's always angry, and you just saw that his heart for the least of them, his heart for the foreigner, for the, you know, and his heart for his family. And even when the Israelites let him down again and went after other gods and were immoral there, and of course it would upset him. And I think one of the saddest verses in the Bible, Genesis 6:5-6, because when God created Adam and Eve and they walked and talked in the cool of the afternoon, and in Luke it says that Adam's son of God. So Adam knew, hey, he belonged, he had identity. But then of course the devil comes along and says, hey, you don't need God to tell you what's good and evil. You can be your own God. And they bought that. And of course, that's what the world to this day is still doing. We will decide what's good and evil, not your God. And so, and then just once that got in, and by the time you get to Genesis 6, there's this verse that the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human beings had become, that he was grieved in his heart that he had made man. That he was grieved in his heart that he had made man. So in other words, you can only be grieved in your heart if you love somebody and they hurt you. If a man walking past there does something wrong, it doesn't grieve my heart. But if my children were to start getting into wickedness and immorality and all the things that the Bible is, it would absolutely grieve my heart, to the point you might even think sometimes, oh, maybe I wish I hadn't had children. This is hurting me so much. And so that's the compassion that God the Father had right through the Bible, all the way right through. That there's this compassion that he longs for a relationship. It's not that, yeah, I mean, he doesn't need us, of course he doesn't, but the fact that he longs for a relationship, that he's pursued us. He, like whenever we rejected God in the Garden of Eden, he didn't reject us. We walked away from him.
That's right.
And he has been pursuing us.
He does.
He pursued me.
Yes.
And I'm so happy to say
Hallelujah.
he caught me. He caught me. And so when I see people thinking that they're doing well, being their own God and making up their own rules for life, and I think, you have no idea. You have no idea. You're missing it by a million miles. You will not find truth out there. You will not find value for yourself out. You will not find worth out there at all. It doesn't belong there. You know?
Yes, that's so true. So many of the people who are listening will have never sensed their father's approval, their father's pleasure in them. They've never heard them say, I love you, I'm proud of you. They've never felt safe with their dad. I was talking with a friend recently, and he's been in ministry for many years, and he began to weep as he shared that his dad never approved of him. And so that goes really deep in our hearts, and it makes us who we are today. What would you say to those who have been traumatized or who struggle from lack of affirmation and love from their fathers? What words of hope can you give them?
Okay. You're absolutely right. I was reading just a couple of months ago, a lady wrote in the Daily Mail, one of our big newspapers here. She said she'd been a very successful author, 37 books, etc., etc., etc. But she said there's a hole in her heart all her life. All her life, she wanted her dad once to say, I love you, or I'm proud of you. And she was by his deathbed in the hope that maybe then he would, but he didn't. And she said, even though I'm successful, I've got money, I've got fame, inside I've had to harden myself and just become a very strong, determined woman, because inside here there's a broken heart, because I just wanted my father once to tell me. The sheer power of that, right? But let me tell you a story first. That was sometimes a story will paint a better picture than the first time. I've probably been around maybe 20 nations now teaching the Father Heart of God, probably all these years. And when I was in Ukraine, but I wasn't teaching the Father Heart in Ukraine. This is going to go way back to maybe 1999, 2000. But I was in this church and the pastor's wife, she was leading the worship, and you could see that she loved Jesus. You could see when she was leading the worship, she didn't play instruments when she was singing. You could see that she loved Jesus. But every night when I was teaching at the church, she was sitting in the front and she would cry her eyes out. So much so that like ladies had to comfort her. And the first night I thought maybe I'd said something that had touched her, or triggered her, offended her, whatever. But the next night, she cried. And so by this stage, we were there for a fortnight, but I'd only about 2 or 3 days left. So I was hoping the pastor would ask me to minister to his wife, but he hadn't as yet. This just was left unmentioned. So I just asked the Lord before I go, could you give me a chance to minister to this lady? So anyway, on the very last day in the morning, the pastor said to me, I wonder, would you minister to my wife before you go? And I said, yes. Why is she crying? He said, I don't know. I've never seen her cry like this ever. I've been too busy. We haven't even had a conversation because with your team here and all that, it's just, we haven't had time. But before you go. So anyway, he could speak perfect English. She couldn't speak any English. So he was translator. And so she was about 33 years of age. She could have been a fashion model. She was one of these very striking women that if you put her on a catwalk, nobody would have blinked at all. But I said to her, why are you crying? And she said, I don't know. And I thought, I've only got like an hour and a half here before the taxi comes to take us away. I thought, oh. So I said, tell me about your earthly father. And here she is, fathers don't speak to me about fathers. So quite clear. So from memory, her first father either died or left when she was about 2, so she can't really remember him. But then her mother married a man, I remember, an architect, but a silly thing to remember after all these years. But this man, because she wasn't his, wouldn't speak to her once in the next 9 years when he was there. Never even acknowledged that she existed. But then he started to drink after a year or two, and he would come home and beat the mother up and break chairs over her back. And if she would go in and try and protect her mother, he would just fling her into a corner. So after 9 years, I can't remember if he died or left. I don't remember that detail, but it was a pretty awful story. So I said, well, what do you think of God the Father? And she put her hands up like that as if, oh. I said, you don't want Father God near you? No. I said, you love Jesus, don't you? Oh, I love Jesus. But I tried everything to convince her. I tried every arrow I had, and I was getting nowhere. And so with about 20 minutes to go, I said, I need to pray. And I said, Lord, you said if we ask for wisdom, you'll give us wisdom. I said, help me, Lord, help me. And so the Lord gave me this. I always say to people, hold on to your theological hats here for a minute. But I said, so you don't want anything to do with God the Father? No. What happens when you get to heaven? I don't know. I'll work that out when I get there. But you want absolutely nothing to do with the Father, God the Father? No. But you love Jesus. Oh, I love Jesus. I said, okay, there's only one thing for it. We've got to get rid of God the Father. So I grabbed an imaginary God the Father by the scruff of the neck, and I walked to the door and I said, God the Father, you are no longer wanted here. Out you go. And I came and I sat down. You feel better now? She says, oh, that's much better now. And I'm sure that her pastor husband was thinking, where is he going with this? So I said, you love Jesus, don't you? She said, I love Jesus. I said, Jesus would have had a good daddy, wouldn't he? She said, oh, Jesus would have had a great daddy. I said, would you like Jesus's daddy to be your daddy? She said, oh, I would love Jesus's daddy to be my daddy. I said, let's ask him. Well, we prayed, and she jumped up, ran round the room shouting, Jesus's daddy is my daddy. And she hugged me. She hugged him. She said, Jesus's daddy is my daddy. And I was back there the following year, and Jesus's daddy was her daddy. God the Father had just so much. The construct in her imagination, the construct in her mind could not have life breathe. That God the Father had to be removed.
Had to go.
And when I've told that, I've seen people give testimonies. That's what cracked me. Yeah, Jesus would have had a good daddy. I would love Jesus' daddy to be my daddy. So sometimes God, the Father, has just got so much built into that image that trying to redeem that image they have, that whole image has to be removed, and you come at it with a fresh sheet. And so I always remember that story. But the other thing is too is that when I say Jesus would have had a good daddy, you know, there at the Jordan, where, you know, God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him." And so, you know, to hear Jesus' daddy said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, I'm proud of you." But yet, whenever he was driven into the wilderness, then straight from that, to have that encounter with Satan, Satan said, "If you're the Son of God," but he left out a very important thing. He left out, "if you're the beloved." That was the word he removed out of it. And you see, then in Romans 8, 15, 16, where, I mean, I often say that the disciples, the early disciples who were obviously totally of Jewish backgrounds, and they wouldn't even say the word God even to this day. I have a Jewish friend who spells it G-D.
Yes.
And so when they heard Jesus, like in, I think it was Mark 4, Mark 14 or something, calling God Abba, Daddy,
Yeah.
the shock must have been unbelievable. He's calling, because Abba, you know, over here, if you were out, people watching outside a coffee shop, and you saw a father coming along with two children here in Northern Ireland, you'd hear them saying, "Daddy, Daddy could have an ice cream." If it was Paris, Papa, Papa could have an ice cream. If it was Dublin, Da, Da. If you went to Jerusalem today, you'd hear, "Abba, Abba can have an ice cream." It's Father, but it's Daddy. And so what I always say is that if a stranger comes to my door, and say my daughter opened the door, and say, "Can I speak to your father?" And she would turn around and say, "Daddy." So only the children can say Abba. And in Romans 8, 15 to 16, where Paul says that we're not only heirs, but we're joint heirs with God. Now, joint heirs, I agree, and the whole unpacking of that, joint heir means that God sees us with the same value as Jesus. And so I remember saying, "Well, Lord, that's a big thing for me." It was the hardest thing for me to get, that I could understand I could be an heir, as Paul says in Galatians. He said we can call him Abba, we're heirs. I get that. But then whenever, you know, in Romans 8, joint heirs. Because you see, when my mum died, her will, I was a joint heir with my sister Sharon, who was a joint heir with Jill. In other words, my mother made no difference. I often say, even though I was firstborn, the most intelligent, my mum decided to make, you know, make a joke out of it. She made no difference at all. What I got, Sharon got. What Sharon got, Jill got. What Jill got, I got. And so I said, "Okay, Lord, you need to prove that to me," because that was the hardest thing for me to get. But when I realized that God twice had said, you know, out loud, "This is my beloved Son," I said, "Well, if I'm a joint heir, then you'd have to call us beloved." So I went onto the computer, typed in, and over 50 times in the New Testament, we are either individually or jointly called beloved. So I often say to people, let's say beloved 52 times. Did you get it? Beloved, 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 beloved. You know, to all who are in Rome, beloved of God, beloved, do not avenge yourselves, therefore having these promises, beloved, but we are bound to give thanks to God always through you, beloved of the Lord, but you, beloved, building up. It's just, and beloved means be loved. And so in a sense, it's the Father heart of God to say, "I am not like your earthly dad.
Yes.
I am the dad you have dreamed of.
The one you've dreamed of.
The one you have dreamed of secretly in here." And I always, at some stage on a weekend's teaching, I always say, "I want you to pretend that you've died, you've gone to heaven, and it's wonderful." But Jesus comes up, and I always say, "I'm not teaching reincarnation. This is just making this up." And Jesus said, "I want you to go back again and come through life again." And you go, no, this is wonderful." I said, but look, if it'll help, I'll send Gabriel over and you can design a dad. And I promise you, if I promise you, you can have the dad you want, would you go down just to bless us? And you say, well, okay, yes, I will. So I say, I'm Gabriel now. Here's my big Pentel pen. If that was real, what words would you tell Gabriel to put down? So I usually end up with about 60 words, like must be compassionate, must listen to you, must have time for you, must love. It's pretty much the same list every time, maybe 60 titles. And then I say to everybody, if you had had a dad like that, would your life be different? And everybody goes, yes. If you had had a dad like that, would you see yourself differently? And they go, absolutely. And I said, well, the bad news is you didn't have a dad like that. I mean, you might have had similar qualities, but not like that. But I said, I have some good news for you as well. There is a dad who has every single one of those qualities. And I go through it with them. And we circle every one. And at the end of it, everybody gets every one of those qualities. I can pull it out of scripture and say, the dad you have all. I always say, at times everybody's so keen, maybe 3-4 people putting their hand up. I say, nobody had to think, now, what's a dream dad like? You just have to say one at a time, please. It pours out of him. And so I say, the dad that you have dreamed of having is Jesus' daddy. And he wants a deep, in fact, he yearns, in fact, he's jealous for a relationship with you. In fact, he says, love me with all your heart. Love me with all your soul. Love me with all your strength. It's not some half-hearted thing. Let's just be friends and text each other occasionally. He yearns jealously, it says in James. His spirit yearns jealously for our love. He doesn't want us to be love the world and love him. He just said, love me with all of your heart. And you know why I can say it? Because he loves us with all of the heart.
And that kind of a daddy will totally revolutionize our life and just change everything.
Everything.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to close. This has been fascinating, but I like to give a call to action. And so those that are listening, I just want to ask you, take the words that Ken has spoken and invite the Lord to bring the lies, the hidden things of darkness, those hidden beliefs that are deep inside, to bring them into the light where he can begin to show you his daddy and show you that there is a God that you have taken a hold of that really is not God at all. And he needs to be gotten rid of. And I know when I did that, I had a similar type experience. And I was so angry, and I said, that kind of God needs to be flushed down the toilet. And God said, well, do it. And I did. And that was the beginning of, oh my goodness, that God isn't the God of the Bible. The Lord Jesus loves you. And he wants you to have his daddy. And he would say to his daddy, you're a good daddy to me. And I love you. And I encourage you to take those words that Ken has spoken and begin to verbally proclaim them. You are a good dad to me, God, and I love you. And then another thing that Ken says, he hasn't really spoken about it here today, but he says, let Jesus tell you who you are. Don't settle for the identity that you got because Satan has lied to you because of the wounds of your father. Let Jesus tell you who you are. And so, in closing, if people want to get a hold of you, Ken, is there a way they can contact you?
They could email me through the website. On the front page at the bottom, there's a little tiny yellow envelope. If they click on that, it'll get straight through to me. I wouldn't want to give out my phone number because you could be getting phone calls at all hours of day and night.
Yes, so I can provide that link below this interview.
Yes.
Okay.
But of course, I would say either the book or the audio book, because it's changed thousands of lives. And it's an audio book as well on Amazon.
Yes, and you have an
Book as
audio
well.
book.
So
Yes.
yeah, so I would say that would be your starting point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who have listened. We're very grateful that you've been with us. So bye-bye. Have a wonderful day.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.